Um, Good evening, everybody. Hello. Thank you to so many of you for squeezing in, and thanks for all devoting your Friday evening to tonight's discussion. My name is Harry Burke. I am Assistant Curator at Artist Space. Tonight's discussion, Palestine, BLM, and Boycott in the Arts, is one of a series of public forums occurring as part of Decolonize This Place, a 3-month project by MTL Plus on invitation of Common Practice New York. From September 17th to December 17th, 55 Walker Street has been converted by the Artist Organizer Collective into an action-oriented community space around the issues of degentrification, indigenous struggle, black liberation, free Palestine, and global wage workers. For the purposes of this project, MTL Plus are holding down the space here, as well as a number of the institutional and programmatic apparatuses of Artist Space. The views and opinions are not necessarily those of Artist Space or members of Common Practice New York. Before handing over to Natasha Dillon of MTL Plus, who will introduce more about the work that has gone into tonight's event and the participating speakers, and introduce the participating speakers, I would like to extend a heartfelt thank you to Common Practice New York, as well as the Friends of Artist Space and the Artist Space Program Fund Artists, as well as all of you here tonight for your ongoing support. Thank you, and to Natasha.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome to Decolonize This Place. Before beginning, I just want to acknowledge that this is the work of so many here. So if people from MTL Plus, could you raise your hand and make yourself visible? Kind of high. How many of you here have made banners, come to actions, and come to raise your hands? Okay, so if you haven't got a pamphlet, get your pamphlet. Huge shout out to Kyle Goen for working with us on this pamphlet. Before we begin, I just want to say that we're having a conversation around Palestine and Black Lives Matter, but we always want to acknowledge that we're on occupied land, and this is occupied Lenape land. So just an acknowledgement to that. And a few community agreements. Please be respectful of each other, of the space. Speak in the I, not the we's. And the format is like this, but we hope that it's a conversation. That's all. And I'm going to hand it over to Andrew Ross of Decolonize This Place as well.
Thank you, Natasha. Warm greetings and welcome to everyone. I'm a member of the MTL Plus team that's holding down this space. It is an action-oriented space, and although we have public events like this every so often, they're not one-off events. They're tied to campaigns, and they're supposed to roll into action. So if you want to get plugged in to some of the initiatives that we've started or set in motion already, every Saturday at 1 p.m. we have orientation meeting, and then 3 p.m. We talk about developing an action. And actually, with respect to this particular topic, there's an organizing meeting tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. for those of you who want to get involved. Natasha already acknowledged that we're on occupied Lenape land, and it's particularly important, doesn't go without saying, it's particularly important and relevant for the topic this evening because although the event has been sparked by the recent statement or expression of solidarity with Palestinian people on the part of the movement for Black Lives, many of you would also know that Standing Rock in North Dakota has also expressed its solidarity with the BDS campaign, which for those of you who don't know, yes. For those of you who don't know, BDS was launched in 2005 by Palestinian civil society, and it has gone from strength to strength ever since, despite organized and well-funded efforts to sabotage it. So in addition to Black Lives Matter movement, those brave souls out in North Dakota who are standing up for indigenous sovereignty, they have insisted that their struggles under settler colonialism do have a lot in common with the struggles of the Palestinian people under the Israeli state's version of settler colonialism. And it's important to remember then that whether you're in the Middle East or here in the USA, there are populations that are under the gun. And for those populations, the violence of the state is experienced on a daily basis. And let us also remember that one of the core legitimating claims of the state is its monopoly on violence. And when you combine that monopoly on violence with a doctrine of racial supremacy, that's a very toxic combination. In fact, it's probably the most toxic combination known to humans. With that in mind, I want to introduce and welcome the speakers for this evening. We're really very fortunate to have Robin Kelley here from Southern California. There is no one better equipped in this country or anywhere else to address the topic of the evening, and certainly no one who has the political clarity and the depth of acute historical analysis that Robin brings with him. We're equally fortunate to have Jasbir Puar here from the... Jasbir's from the tri-state area.
I'm from New Jersey.
She is a absolutely fearless and brilliant analyst of and advocate for the Palestinian cause. And then after they both spoken and offered comments, we had a couple of responses from two members of the MTL Plus crew. And those would be the extraordinary Amin Husain and, and the remarkable Marz Saffore. And both of them are exemplary models of the artist as organizer profile that we're really trying to develop here at Decolonize This Space. So without further ado, I want to give the floor to Robin.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, I might take this off well, no, actually, you know, if you can hear me, I just, okay, so let me just begin by a couple of acknowledgements. One, this is an amazing space, an amazing organizing space, and people doing amazing work. So I just want to acknowledge how exciting this is. And it makes me miss New York, you know, I have to say. Yeah, we'll see. The other thing, just to say, in terms of the space, I have very great memories, because across the street, for the musicians, know that the Electric Church was on Walker Street, and that there was a jam session place all night long. Some of the greatest musicians, like right across the street, were there, and I had great times. But let me just begin, speaking of history, by acknowledging that yesterday was the 60th anniversary of the massacre of 275 Palestinians in Khan Yunis. That was November 3rd, 1956. And 9 days after that was the repeated action in Rafah, where 200 unarmed Palestinians were killed by the IDF. And it's significant because, for our discussion, because it was precisely that massacre, the Khan Yunis massacre and the massacre in Rafah, in Gaza, that inspired Malcolm X to write his essay, Zionist Logic. Because in 1964, he visited Gaza, and he heard people remember that massacre. And I just wanted to acknowledge that and have us sort of think about that, because it was in that piece that he wrote in the Egyptian Gazette in September 1964, where he concluded that Zionism represented a new form of colonialism, right? And so part of what we're going to talk about today, and forgive me because I'm going to be very formal and read something because I have 15 minutes, and I want to just get through it rather than just, what I typically do is just get off topic. And so what we're going to talk about today is like about the bridge between Black solidarity and the Palestinian struggle and vice versa has been there for a while, and why the Movement for Black Lives platform is a new moment and where it might lead us. So let's just begin with the idea of Black Palestinian solidarity. Solidarity is always an aspiration, right? So we have to be clear, it's an aspiration as well as a kind of shorthand for the grounds of solidarity. But we have to be clear about this because there's never been a time in history when the vast majority of Black people supported the right of Palestinian self-determination. It just hasn't. Let's be realistic about that. We like to romanticize. There's never been a time. Or when the vast majority of Black people criticize Israeli policy, or the vast majority of Palestinians, either in the occupied territories or in 48 Palestine, or living in exile, actively supported Black liberation, okay? And why should we expect anything else, especially since it could be argued that most African Americans don't support Black liberation? Face it, they don't. So why should we expect more? And my point is not to disavow Black Palestinian solidarity, but to contextualize it. And all solidarities for that matter, So solidarity is a political stance. It's not a racial imperative. Too often we fall for the trick bag of associating race or nationality, which is to say bodies, with particular political positions. It's almost like conflating the policies of the state of Israel with Jews, which is not only inaccurate, but ahistorical and anti-Semitic. And this kind of essentialism leads us down some interesting political cul-de-sacs. To cite one example, activists working on Palestinian solidarity have recently gotten a lot of pushback from so-called Black progressives who point to Palestinian anti-Black racism as a reason why we should not build solidarity. Now, no solidarity is natural. That's why it's a political imperative. Solidarities are often fragile, they're temporary, they're always forged in struggle, and they're sustained through very hard work. Solidarity can produce internal fracturing within groups, sharp disagreements, new alliances, because they're constituted historically in real time, place, and conditions. And no solidarity based on identity of any kind can achieve unanimity. What I mean by that is to say, anti-Black racism does not produce a united, uniform, unanimous Black anti-racist response, nor do the depredations of Israeli settler colonialism produce a similarly unified Palestinian response. Differences by class, by tactics, by generation, location, experience can generate ideological divisions, making solidarity among Palestinians and among Black people difficult enough. So we should not be surprised to discover Palestinian anti-Black racism, or Black anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia, or reluctance to build alliances between these communities, or what is often the most common response, indifference. Yeah. So to expect otherwise to ignore the historical context and the political reality. So now let me just turn to some history, because that's what I do. So let's begin with 1948. So we know 1948. 1948 is what? It's the year of the founding of Israel. It's the year of the Nakba, or the catastrophe, in the context of an anti-colonial war with Britain. A war in which the Haganah and other Jewish commando units ethnically cleansed some 750,000 Palestinians from 380 villages, and the new state of Israel barred the refugee populations from the right to return or reclaim lost land, homes, personal property, and bank accounts. 1948 was the year of the Afrikaner National Party came to power in South Africa, beginning with the implementation of formal apartheid. 1948 was the year of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. 1948 marked a turning point in Black resistance to Jim Crow. First in 1947, Du Bois, on behalf of the NAACP, and 14 million Black people submits a document to the United Nations detailing a list of grievances against the United States for violating human rights of Black people. At the height of the Cold War, this kind of publicity did not play well over the world stage. The U.S. was trying to prove its superiority as a liberal market democracy. And and that's better than socialism. That was a claim they were making. And this compelled the State Department to support desegregation, you know. And so what is 1948? 1948 is the Supreme Court ruled against restrictive covenants. The result, you know, of that was you have the Civil Rights Committee being formed, and what happens in response to that? The Southern Democrats break with the Democratic Party and form the States' Rights Party, or the racist Dixiecrats, in 1948, at the same time that Henry Wallace forms the Progressive Party. So this is kind of the context, and the main point here is that the rise of Dixiecrats whose radicalism fell short of succession launched massive resistance to desegregation in the South. In other words, just as South Africa and Israel are creating a modern state formed based on ethno-nationalism, but doing so in the context of massive struggle, a similar struggle is taking place in the United States. So the grounds of solidarity are there, just in terms of the conditions. So first we need to understand, you know, that black identification with Zionism predates the formation of Israel as a modern nation state. I mean, I guess what I should say, just to preface that, is that when Israel became a state, became a nation, you know, emerged out of this, in 1948, most black leaders were celebrating the state of Israel. They were not talking about the Nakba. They were not talking about dispossession. And why is that? I mean, Zionism's connected to the book of Exodus. The idea of Israel is with the book of Exodus, with Jews coming out of Egypt. It was a narrative that actually spoke to black emancipation. It was a narrative that we saw during Reconstruction. And we saw in Garveyism, you know, the narrative of Zionism, of freedom through this, the book of Exodus. Given the long-standing identification with Zionism, it shouldn't surprise us that most black leaders in the black press welcomed Israel's formation in 1948. And I'm talking about people like A. Philip Randolph and W.E. Du Bois had nothing to say about the Arab dispossession. And I'm not suggesting that most black intellectuals, activists, and political leaders in 1948, like who defended Zionism in the war, were dupes, nor were they acting out of some obligatory commitment to the Black-Jewish alliance. Rather, with the exception of people like George Schuyler, it was virtually impossible for them to see Israel as a colonial project, specifically as a settler colonial state founded on the subjugation of indigenous peoples. And by indigenous peoples, we're talking about Palestinian Muslims, Christians, Bedouin, Mizrahi Jews, and imported racialized labor. And they did that with the backing of international law. Why is that? Well, the convergence of Israel's Zionist roots, which is a nationalist ideology generated partly in opposition to racist, ethnic, religious oppression, but also motivated by this imperative to bring modernization to the so-called backward Arab people. You know, like we're gonna have the ground bloom in Israel. And the convergence of that in the post-Ottoman reorganization of the region, this put Jewish settlers in conflict with British imperialism. So the nationalist and anti-colonial character of Israel's war of independence camouflaged its own colonial project. Secondly, if we think like Aimé Césaire and Hannah Arendt, if we think of the Holocaust as a manifestation of colonial violence, then Israel comes into being as a nation identified as victims of colonial racist violence forged through an armed insurrection against British imperialism. So it's a narrative that renders invisible the core violence of the Nakba. The myth of Israel's heroic war of liberation against the British convinced even the most anti-colonial intellectuals to link Israel's independence with African independence. And then again, you go back, Israel saw itself as a third world nation until they were finally sort of exposed. You know, and at some point, even Israel's ruling party pursued alliances with newly independent African nations. Now, of course, before 1967, there were black critics of Zionism, like Malcolm X I mentioned, who expressed solidarity with dispossessed Palestinians. But the Arab-Israeli War changed everything. It not only enabled a sharper African-American critique of Zionism and the possibilities of solidarity with the PLO, but it produced a sense of betrayal from liberal Zionists, many of whom were supporters of the Civil Rights Movement, who equated criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. In other words, this is not new. at all. It really raises up in 67. Liberal Zionists detested any characterization of Israel as a colonial regime, and yet this is exactly what an increasingly radical internationalist and vocal core of activists concluded. Black Panther Party, could talk about that, could talk about, all kinds of stuff. Let me just say something about SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because the event that drew the most ire from liberal Zionists was the publication of Third World Roundup, the Palestine problem, Test Your Knowledge. Now, to be fair, there's elements of that statement that was anti-Semitic. You could go back and look at some of the imagery. There's no question about it. And I would argue that that's the case. That's not all that happened. However, it portrayed the 6-year war as a war of dispossession, 6-day war, rather, the Arab-Israeli war, as a war of dispossession. Israel was portrayed as a colonial state backed by US imperialism, and Palestinians as victims of racial subjugation. So in other words, black identification with Zionism as a striving for land and a striving for self-determination gave way after 1967 to a radical critique of Zionism as a form of settler colonialism akin to American racism and South African apartheid. And to be fair, we don't have time to go into this, but there are many left Jews who broke with Zionism too after 67, and some who actually became more committed. So let me just, in closing, leap to the present and talk about this as a turning point. So the summer of 2014 was a crucial historical conjuncture in which Palestinian black solidarity both deepened and became more complicated. And Angela Davis's book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, I would really suggest that to people. And she identifies that moment. And we all lived through that. We all lived and witnessed, whether on YouTube or on television, the killings of Eric Garner and Ezell Ford and Kajimi Powell and John Crawford III and Michael Brown. And we all saw how these killings were immediately linked to Israel's latest war in Gaza. That activists drew connections between Israeli racialized state violence in the name of security and US racialized state executions. And not just in terms of what's happening in Palestine, in terms of drone strikes abroad and the killing of black men and women and transgender people at the hands of the police, and the role that Israeli companies and security forces played in arming and training US police departments. Palestinian activists were among the first to issue solidarity statements in support of the protests surrounding the killing of Eric Garner and Mike Brown. And over the course of the following year, young organizers from Ferguson, as well as members of the Movement for Black Lives Matter as well, Dream Defenders in Florida, they joined delegations to the West Bank. And over 1,100 black activists, artists, scholars signed a black solidarity statement with Palestine endorsing BDS. And it didn't seem like it was a big deal then, but it was a huge deal, that you got 1,100 people, black people, to sign it. And I won't repeat what's in that document, but I would suggest check it out. The document does identify the US aid to Israel and corporate investments in buttressing Israeli apartheid, singling out the massive private security firm G4S for its complicity in incarcerating thousands of Palestinian political prisoners and hundreds of black and brown youth held in private juvenile prisons in the US. So these were the political grounds on which the Movement for Black Lives was formed and produced. In other words, that statement didn't come out of nowhere. You really got to understand 2014 as a turning point, August of 2014, and what followed. And I'm sure people here have read it. It's incredible, it's ambitious, it lays out 6 demands that center on ending all forms of violence and injustice endured by black people, redirecting resources from the carceral and military state to education, health, and safety, creating a just, democratically controlled economy, and securing black political power with a genuinely inclusive democracy. Now, you also know that it was precisely its statement on Palestine that threatened to derail the whole public discussion around the entire document. Dozens of publications, media outlets condemned the Movement for Black Lives for criticizing the occupation and for doing 2 things. One, calling it an apartheid state, and two, characterizing the ongoing war in Gaza and the West Bank as genocide. Now, we know, and I'm not actually going to say this, we could talk about it, but the Movement for Black Lives is not the first to argue that Israeli policies meet the UN definition of apartheid and the UN definition of genocide. Okay, we could debate that. I'm gonna skip over that because I want to come to the close, but we could debate that if you want to, but really, the evidence is pretty clear. They're not the first ones to say that either. And the arguments they make are legitimate. But what's significant about the statement is that they did not back down. They defended the position. They did not move an inch. In the past, people be running, thinking they're gonna lose their funding, and we shouldn't have said that, and people fighting each other, and like, I can't believe you wrote genocide, I didn't proofread it. You know, that's not what happened. They stood by it, and they did not worry about losing legitimacy or funding, but they stood its ground on principle. And at the same time, the statement generated some soul searching among folks on the left, particularly in Jewish Voice for Peace. JVP had a really, real sort of, I wouldn't call it a crisis, it's actually better than that. It's a real struggle over the question of what's their position with regard to the statement. And JVP came out and supported the statement. That's big. And in their debates, they were actually saying, you know what, we actually have to consider Israeli policies as genocidal. You know? So they made this huge qualitative leap because of their commitment to solidarity. The solidarity is not about just holding the line together, but making a leap together and rethinking what we think of as a prevailing wisdom. So in the end, Black Palestinian solidarity is based on the principle of resisting injustice everywhere and recognizing that the Zionist logic undergirding the founding and management of the State of Israel is based on racialization and colonial domination. Fighting anti-Black racism and all forms of racism is a basic principle of the BDS movement. As it grows in size, strength, and success, we really should expect BDS to continue to be governed by the politics best summed up in Dr. Martin Luther King's unfigurable line, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And that's the same as saying, you know, solidarity forever, basically. So, thank you.
Thank you for having me here, and thank you for coming out. I'm super honored to be here, and there's so many things that Robin said that I would love to talk about, and hopefully we'll get to a lot of that in the discussion. I was charged with some very specific things to ruminate upon, specifically the question or the hypothesis that BDS hasn't taken off in the arts sector. Was the terminology that was used. It seemed very, you know, Cold War, East Germany sector thing. But anyway, it was a little confusing to me. And then also, why is it easier to organize around BDS in academia? So as someone who is not, and I'm saying that I'm kind of, I would not agree with either of those assessments. So I'm gonna try to break some of that stuff down. As someone who is not in the arts sector and someone who is an academic. So I wanted to start with some questions, right? It's unclear to me what the art sector means. So what are we talking about when we say artists in the United States are not agitating around BDS or organizing around Palestine? If the BDS movement in the United States is highly articulated within institutional contexts. So what are the institutional contexts that matter for the artist sector or for artists in general? What are the institutional contexts that quote unquote govern the art world? What would the targets be? Are we talking about associations? Are we talking about museums? Are we talking about art fairs, markets? Are we talking about events, film festivals? Are we talking about galleries? So what is it exactly that needs to be focused upon as a particular site of struggle or site of solidarity? And then I would say, what are the goals of specifically focusing on artists and the BDS movement? Is it to change artistic practice and political culture in the United States? Is it to support Palestinian artists in Palestine? Which is something I would say BDS, in terms of the academic boycott, is not something that it actually does. The academic boycott in US universities really is far more transformative for the political cultures, or attempts to be transformative for the political cultures in academe, more so than it actually helps scholars in Palestine navigate academic censorship and academic freedom. So this is and the one exception I would say to that, it would be the National Women's Studies Association, which passed with an 88% vote, not a boycott resolution, but a full endorsement of the BDS platform and the 3 principles of the BDS platform. And along with that, stipulated that there had to be some kind of programming set up that would actually support Palestinian scholars in their efforts to connect with scholars in the United States and elsewhere. So are the goals about challenging our artistic institutional context in the United States? Is it about changing the kinds of political and cultural conversations that are happening? And then if there is an understanding that this is about more than the paucity of US political culture, where are Palestinian artists? What kind of work are they doing? What are their conditions of employment and of working in Israel 48, in the West Bank, in Gaza? And what kinds of solidarity and support would be helpful, would be available, would be wanted? So these are some of the questions that I wanted to start with. Why am I asking all these questions? Because from my vantage point, since I have been involved with BDS, which I would say is actually quite late, from 2009 on, so the call had already been out for 4 years, I have been involved with so many artists that have been involved in BDS circuits since that time. In particular, in anti-pinkwashing movements and discussions, it's really important to remember that the Brand Israel campaign first targeted artists and cultural workers. They wanted to fly in artists and fund them on these massive trips and show them how vibrant their art scene was. They were very specifically targeted. In particular, the cities of Toronto, San Francisco, and New York were targeted, and their film festivals were targeted in terms of sponsoring artists to participate in these film festivals and also funding these film festivals as well. One of the earliest successful anti-pinkwashing campaigns was the boycott against Frameline in San Francisco, where there was a demand to reject funding from the Israeli consulate. And since it was not met by Frameline, all of these artists pulled their films from the festival, right? The Frameline Festival being an annual LGBT festival in San Francisco. This also then led to subsequent boycott of the Toronto International Film Festival by filmmaker John Grayson, because one year they were having a spotlight on Israel, and he refused to show his film when they refused to cancel the spotlight, which then led to a number of other withdrawals from other people who had submissions accepted, and then led to the Queer Palestinian Film Festival in Toronto yearly now, which started actually by films that were screened and projected onto art institutions in Toronto on the sides of the buildings during the summer at night. It seems to me that there are continuing with goals. Are the goals of this about organizing as artists? organizing as art institutions or organizations? Is it about getting more artists involved in BDS solidarity spaces? Because there are a lot around in different spaces, right? Is it about encouraging more artistic production about Palestine? There's certainly been I would say, a kind of parallel movement in academic scholarship, where there are more and more scholars turning to Palestine, not necessarily as the work that one does, but informing the work that they do, or the kinds of comparative and historical analyses that start bringing Palestine deeper into the question of, for example, what American studies is, right? This was one of the big projects, the intellectual movements that had to happen at the American Studies Association, was to convince everyone that Israel was part of the story of the United States, right? Do we want to encourage networks between artists here and those in Palestine? And again, is there a kind of support network for Palestinian artists that could come of all of this? So I'm going to tell two stories of organizing that I have been involved with. So first is the pinkwashing story, and the second is the American Studies Association story that Robin was also actually more centrally involved in, but and kind of flag the things that could be useful for other solidarity stories to emerge. So artists actually led the anti-pinkwashing movement in a way, or solidarity, the emergence of solidarity networks. It was largely Elle Flanders and John Grayson in Toronto. I'm going to appropriate Toronto as United States for just a moment. Let's just pretend. Let's just wish. So, and you know, and it's of course it's a different context, because the Canadian government provides an actually really legitimate support to artists in ways that they just don't in the United States. So these are some of the the kind of structural constraints, of course. The language of pinkwashing is already, when we start talking about art washing, anti-gentrification movements in terms of galleries or whitewashing, these languages are already intimately connected. So if your communities are having these conversations about art washing and whitewashing, it's not that the logic of pinkwashing is already embedded in that. And so that leap to BDS is not that far off, right? These are linked lexicons. They're shared logics. They can be usefully connected. Sarah Schulman was one of the main mobilizers in the United States. She organized a queer Palestinian tour. There were a group of queer Palestinians that wound up doing an incredible amount of outreach to progressive queer organizations all over the United States. After that, and this was really about who are the allies that we haven't had a conversation with yet. Like, who are the potential? How do we grow solidarity, right? Robin was more eloquent about solidarity is not natural, so how do we feed it? How do we make it, envision it for people? Then there was a LGBT delegation, the first and I think only, and I really hope only, LGBT delegation, where there were 16 homosexuals on a bus for 8 days. It was a bad joke. It was the beginning of a bad joke, but it was something that was. This was in 2012, so this was almost 5 years ago now, in January 2012, and this was an almost impossible feat. That Sarah spent a year asking at least 100 quote-unquote high-profile queers to go onto this delegation, and there were, and then we wound up with 16, right? So there was an incredible amount of resistance and an incredible amount of knocking on doors and having conversations and having these conversations over and over again to get this delegation together. Barbara Hammer was on this delegation. Roya Rostigar was on this delegation. So prominent artists. There was a solidarity statement that came out afterwards. And I think delegations are complicated political tools. They are a form of political tourism. And when you go on a delegation, you're going to have the same pictures that I got on my delegation, even though it's an LGBT delegation. Robin was on the American Studies Association delegation. They are complicated tools, but BDS has supported and asked for delegations to be part of the way in which solidarity bridges can happen. So they are actively promoting delegations as part of how people start to understand what is actually happening in the West Bank, what is Palestine. And in this case, I think delegations actually provide an infrastructural context for the lack of an institutional context, right? So there wasn't any, anti-pinkwashing 101 organization that we could just say, hello, we're going to keep knocking on your doors. We had to create it, and the delegation was a way of creating an institutional context that we would then be accountable to and for. So this seems to be one of the issues, right, in terms of the artist sectors, that institutional context can be vague, they can be lacking, they can be diffuse, they can be numerous, they can be spread out. Individuals can really be on their own in a sense. And I would say the pinkwashing story is parallel to that we had to create a structural elements to make things cohere. And from there, there was this amazing thing, this anti-pinkwashing solidarity movement became a thing. And it was a real thing for probably 4 or 5 years until it started dissipating and people started moving off into other directions. One of the most successful organizations was Queers United Against Israeli Apartheid in Toronto, which has now disbanded because everyone's working on different kinds of BDS and Black Lives Matters and Indigenous rights movements in conjunction with each other. So when we say that BDS is the floor, not the ceiling, this is, I think, one thing that we mean, that BDS is just the beginning, the kind of introduction to the work in front of us, that things start, here's an entry point, and so whatever your entry point is, it is the way in, it's the gateway drug, and then you have to kind of move on from there, right? So pinkwashing and LGBT queer identity was a kind of gateway and entry point for quite some time, and then opening for people to then really start learning more. It was really great. So some things went really well. There were events that were boycotted. There were things like World Pride in Tel Aviv that was challenged, or I think it was in Jerusalem. There are things that went really well. There were things that just that were immovable. So, for example, the Center for Lesbian and Gay, not the center, the Lesbian and Gay Community Center in New York City refused to host a fundraiser for the flotilla that was headed to Gaza. I think this was in the summer of 2011, I want to say. And the donors kicked in, and we had a town hall, but that was immovable, right? So that's an institutional space that we decided not to waste our time on, in some sense. It wasn't a space that was going to take up the challenge that everything that they did in the space was political, including dealing with BDS. So that's a little bit about the anti-pinkwashing movement work. The ASA story, Robin also knows a lot about this story. There are just a few things I'll say. First of all, it took years and years and years. So the idea that it's easier to organize in academia, I think, it's a false one in terms of how much foresight and how much planning it took. There was an initial effort to pass a boycott resolution that completely failed, did not raise any kind of conversation or discussion. It was just flat out denied. And I think this was like in 2007 or 2008. Post 9/11, there was an organization called Teachers Against War that formed, that eventually morphed into U.S. academic and cultural boycott of Israel. And US ACB also supports artists. It's not just for academics. So there are any number of artists who have signed on to US ACB's statement. And US ACB provides support, it's not an academic organization, it provides support to other kinds of organizations, including artistic organizations as well. There was also another high-profile delegation, which Robin was on. This also led to, and I hate to say it, but when you see certain people signing up for certain things, people who are on the fence or who don't have or want to make the time to educate themselves, they will feel a little better. You know, when Judith Butler said, I'm signing on to this, and again, it was a late signing. It was, I think, 2008 or 2009. It took a while. But there were a lot of queers who were like, okay, I don't have to think about this. Judith Butler's doing it. I'm just going to sign this. You know? And I'm sorry to be a little cynical about this, but there's also that kind of solidarity, which is just like, I don't know, we can make up a good name for it or something. The pseudo-solidarity. But you still need those signatures, right? You still need those people showing up for things, or at least not fighting you, right? So there was also a town hall at ASA. It really mattered, and I was going to suggest maybe there needs to be a town hall with the Chinatown Art Brigade or whatever other organizations you want to work with. Maybe this is our town hall, I don't know, but the town halls are really important for airing out community anxieties, sensibilities, concerns. One thing is that institutions are very idiosyncratic. So one suggestion I have is really to mine the idiosyncrasies of different institutions. So Rutgers University, where I work, has, I don't know how this happened, but somebody 4 or 5 years ago decided to hire Sherry Wolf as our union campaign organizer, right? So this was like, I was teaching in Beirut for the year, and I came back, and there was Sherry Wolf working on my campus to foment dissent, basically. Her job is to cultivate resistance. And I just thought, I am having the greatest dream. I can't believe this is happening, to us. Right? But right now, Rutgers is this unbelievable place to do this kind of work because the union support is amazing. So when I started getting attacked by all of these right-wing press and Zionists and the Wall Street Journal. In February, the union came out, made the statements, the university administration couldn't say a thing, and that's a place where you can agitate, right? That's where you put your time and energy into. That's the idiosyncrasy of Rutgers. It probably has the strongest union in the country of any academic institution. So we head there. We figure out what to do there, right? NYU is similarly a place that hasn't been rocked by much controversy at all. The UC systems have been awful, right? The UC, the California schools have been really, really tough for people. The small liberal arts colleges are terrible because the donor influences are really intense. Vassar is awful. Dartmouth is awful. Bard is awful. These are places where students are really, really in need of support. But there are also places where where the donor influence is so strong that it's almost about kind of getting those students out of there and getting them in other places where they can actually have conversations that they need to have. The last thing I'll say about this is that once you become a target, everything starts amping up. So if you want to have these conversations, you have to make something that's a problem, right? And people will come out and start arguing, and that's the way to get things going. And I think that's what's happening tonight. I think this forum for some has been a problem, and it's getting people out, and it's getting people motivated, and it's going to just keep going from there in terms of continuing a debate and a conversation. The last thing, there's one other point also about the way that academic boycotts work. which is about institutions and not individuals. And we had to be very clear about this over and over again with the ASA. I think for artists, it's more difficult. It actually implicates individual work in a much more difficult way. The spaces are scarcer, so it's harder for an artist to, say, pull out a film or pull out of a gallery opening without support. So I would say there needs to be support network from established artists, from people who have leverage, and I think that's what Sarah Schulman, Elle Flanders, and John Grayson, Barbara Hammer, that's what those folks are doing, and we need to keep pushing them around that and saying, you need to figure out how to make Boycott work for us instead of penalizing us. How can a boycott work for vulnerable artists instead of penalizing them, right? So that's the question. What are the support systems? There are infrastructural support systems and also a kind of like a toolkit, like what happens when you're dealing with backlash. We started putting together toolkits. The first thing I can say is just don't answer any emails. Do not answer any, no matter how upset you are, just don't answer that email, right? That's calling you horrible names and telling you that they're gonna stalk you or whatever they're gonna say, no. But, you know, one of the things we did that we started doing in academic context was actually supporting Students for Justice in Palestine organizations because they are the most vulnerable. They are being targeted by Canary Mission, by Campus Watch. The students are doing the bulk of the work. They need our help. And so there are any number of faculty and staff for justice in Palestine organizations that are now arising at various institutions. So what would a kind of artist equivalent or something in the artist sector equivalent look like? What would that be like? The last thing I wanted to say is slightly tangential to this, but it speaks to the ways in which we can grow different kinds of solidarity. I am currently finishing a book called The Right to Maim, States of Debility, Disability, something like that. So I should know this. So the book really started out with, it really started out as a kind of concern about disability rights platforms and thinking through what disability justice organizing would look like. And at this particular moment, it looks precisely like this convergence between Black Lives Matter and pro-Palestinian solidarity work, not just because of genocide, but because of the targeting to injure, to kill, to disable, to debilitate, that is an active policy. You've probably been reading about kneecapping campaigns in the West Bank, the targeting to maim instead of kill, which is seen as a humanitarian act, when in actuality it's about keeping people permanently imprisoned in a debilitated state, right? These are things that disability rights and pride platforms cannot grasp. They cannot really attend to. So 2 years ago, New York City started up again their disability pride marches in the summer. So this past year it was July 10th, and the People's Power Assembly marched both years, and they marched, and so you have all of these corporate entities and the UN Declaration of Support for People with Disabilities folks in that march, and then you have the People Powers Assembly with their signage saying support the Black Lives movement, support the Black Lives Matter movement, stop killing Black America, police brutality kills X number of people in the Black community. Black disabled people are 50% of the targets of police shootings. So suddenly you have this whole other obvious and yet not connected element as part of a disability pride march, countering the pride narrative, right? Or at least complicating it. So I think that, Palestine is next, that next year's disability pride march should be a place where we come together with Black Lives Matters folks, with with a charge about not just Israeli genocide, but the active desire to debilitate and disable communities so that they live in a kind of perpetual state of debilitation and deprivation around certain bodily capacities as well as access to basic infrastructure, right? So I just wanted to end with that's what I'm working on as an action, not as a part of a march, but as an action with People's Power Assembly and also hopefully MTL for next summer. Thank you.
I'm going to take very little time. I worked with a lot of people in this space to create this zine. It begins with writings from Robin Kelley that are relevant, that he references, at least partly in his talk. The same with Jasbir Puar. And also, a specific reference to the Right to Maim book that's coming out and some excerpts from there, as well as a piece she wrote in Jadaliya in relation to a lot of attacks that all of you that are working on BDS kind of face. But also, I just kind of want to put it out there. I'm coming at this as a Palestinian as well, right? So I'm putting that in the room. And as an artist and an organizer who is trained in law and who had to deal a lot with white supremacy that seemed to cross with Zionism if you wanted to work on Wall Street, including being asked in interviews whether I support suicide bombings as an opportunity to get a job. Or when I was a lecturer at the Lauderpack Research Center for International Law, lecturing at King's College around self-determination, being called in by a deputy director called Daniel Bethlehem, who represented Israel after the Jenin massacre in early 2000, and asked me, since you're talking about self-determination, I just want to check in with you and see, what you're doing. Usually Palestinians get emotional about these things, So these things, but these things, right, they're structural, and that's what Robin was reminding us earlier when we were just having a chat. So what I'm going to do is just kind of show a few slides that a lot of people in this room have been working out, and one thing we joke about, aside from like, thanks, Papa, right, is, shout out to Kyle Goen for making this happen. But really take a look at this because a lot of love went into this. A couple of just kind of remarks about what was said. I think, and this is, again, I'm drawing on personal experience and I'm humbled to be here. The 6-Day War in 1967 was never a war, right? That was mythology. That was a narrative. That was a construction of a narrative of the little person defeating the big person, right? And Israel always wanted to have that war, but that war, the Jordanians withdrew, the Syrians never came, the Iraqis, right? Like that whole thing was a joke because it was always part of taking, Palestine. And what was interesting about that, and the way I know this is from my father, he said in 1948, Palestinians, they left because they were afraid and they thought they would come back. In 1967, they learned. So my family in the West Bank never left. What they did was they left their home and went under a fig tree. And for 2 months, when the army was on the main roads, right, they would go in and sneak into the house and make some food and then come back out under the fig tree, right? So there was never a war, and that was part of the mythology of Israel as being a thing. But, times change. So that's just kind of a 2 cents on there. One of the things about BDS, and I think we wrote this in Hyperallergic, and I think it's relevant to bring up right now before I get to these actions, because we as artists, like the artist cap on for a second, is we think boycotting is about not talking. Boycotting is somehow like not being Not the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression is somewhat, we're not furthering dialogue, right? That's what social practice tells you. That's what creative time tells you. That's what everyone that's giving us grants right now, they tell us, like, go have the conversation about the mass displacement that's going on in the Bronx, right? Get some money, and you know, if you're black or you're brown, you'll get that money, right? Because you're displacing, and you're kind of a hot commodity at the moment. But the thing about boycott is that it changes the conversation, right? It shifts the conversation, and I think that's important. We have to have a conversation about justice, not a conversation with communities that we're displacing, just as an example, right? So that's one thing that we said, and again, it's in here. And then I think the second thing that we kind of talk about, and because we're interested in talking to our community, and I think this is a town hall, at least one to begin with, right? And it has to look this way because we also have to share knowledge. But you know, boycott, and I'll just read this last paragraph, boycott changes our relationships and practices in the face of multiple and intersecting forms of oppression. Whether one claims to be against racism and white supremacy, patriarchy, colonialism, apartheid, or occupation matters little if we refuse to acknowledge our own complicity in the existence of the injustice. As artists, we should take action in our lives and in our practice to fight that injustice. The conversations we have, the learning and unlearning that ensues, and the bonds formed, those are all wins for us. Those are real. Right? It's not a campaign that you win because there's a next campaign. The campaigns are always tactical. The learning and unlearning is for life, and it's generational, right? So those are kind of two things that I'm just putting in there in the room. But I want to focus on something called BDS as the floor, not the ceiling, and imagine these conversations in this context, because truth is that the art world is really hard to understand. And money is being moved on a global scale with our artwork, right, with our labor. And we have no control over and where it goes. So the idea of boycott what is a real thing. Boycott what when you can't eat? That's also a real thing. But what's most interesting about boycott, if we're learning from apartheid South Africa, leaving aside the fact that apartheid only brought a neoliberal model where struggle still continues right now, and black and brown bodies are still being exploited, leaving that aside for a second. The political, just learning from that example, that was how many years ago? Now we have advanced capitalism, we have modes of financing, we have structures that actually you can't even know what you're boycotting and where the money is coming from. They call it transparency or lack thereof, right? There's no transparency in where the funding is coming from. You can just put a shell in multiple shells and it looks great and you're like, what am I boycotting? Tell me and I'll boycott, right? If you're at that level. So I think the examples we'll look at is like BDS is the floor, not the ceiling, just like Palestine isn't about a state. And we talked about this. It's a metaphor for freedom. It's a metaphor for justice. And the anti-colonial struggle never ended, right? And it's just different forms, and we have to kind of internalize that for a minute. I'm going to stand up just so I can see the screen. Maybe I can take this with me. Oh, do you have a mobile mic? I'll be really quick. So, Creative Time. How many people get funding from Creative Time or done projects for Creative Time? One person, two people. Okay. Well, three, because I'm hiding. All right. Well, you know, Creative Time is all about social practice, right? But this is an important moment. It's not calling out Creative Time. It's just sharing some knowledge. So Creative Time, Ann Pasternak used to be the head of Creative Time, right? And at that same time, Laura Rakovitz used to be head of Global Strategic something. And Nato Thompson is a curator. So they had their summit and we were invited. And Musarrin Collective, a feminist collective, during the uprisings in 2012 withdrew. They tweeted at a bunch of us, and Rebel Diaz from the Bronx withdrew. And then we were wondering, you know, what are we going to do? So we actually had a conversation with Creative Time folks, and they said, you know what, we're not getting any funding from anyone. This whole issue is a misunderstanding. And we're like, all right. So what are you going to do? It's like, we're going to actually get to the bottom of this, and at the beginning of the summit, we're going to address it. The summit was about inequality. Hyperallergic broke the story. You're looking at the thing, we were there presenting, there's a picture in their kind of reporting. And Nato Thompson had promised us that he would tell thousands of people in the room that there was an issue around boycott. Because artists withdrew, and we didn't. Josh McPhee, Michael Rakowitz, a lot of us didn't, because we thought that we want to have a conversation. That's what they keep saying, let's have the conversation, right? But in fact, he got down, and what he said was just like, you gotta do what you gotta do. That's real, right? So what did we do? We scrapped our presentations, and we actually talked about BDS. We talked about it. And then that was a conversation then. So it's always measured, right? It's not that we want to cause discord in our community, but we want to frame the conversation. So they promise us they're going to have a series of conversations. Then they give us a commission. So we go to Palestine, we do some stuff about Palestine, we come back, we're still working on stuff. We put out 3 kind of communiques around Palestine. They get published on Creative Time Reports. And then we see Ann Pasternak's husband doing something at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. We're just like, what's that? So we tweeted that, and then we found out that they have a whole show happening at the Technion. Okay. So Technion University is a crazy spot, right? Like all universities, they produce technology that is either good or bad. In our case, it's mostly bad. So this militarized the drone, created the caterpillar that bulldozes houses, right? And the show, Living as Form, curated by Nato Thompson and Creative Time, was at the Technion University. I don't know. Living as Form, right? Social practice, like the thing. All right. So we organize, we contact them, things happen on Facebook. They say, no, it's we didn't even know about it, all this thing, it's fine. We can't take a position on BDS, whatever. So we organized and over 100 artists and thinkers, including Judith Butler and Gayatri Spivak and Andrew and Nicholas Murray, all of us, right? So that's, and people withdrew. And we're like, okay, that's cool. So that was the beginning of our kind of engagement with this. So then the war broke out. 2014 is no joke, right? That was like a turning point in the relationships here. Lessons learned from Occupy. Race needs to be at the center of the conversation, not just class, right? Those are real. So we did, as Direct Action Front for Palestine, because we go under a lot of names, did kind of a march on the Brooklyn Bridge, but really kind of what was going on over there is something else, which is a 90-foot by 45-foot banner, right, that a lot of amazing folks worked on. And that was kind of after that, on my birthday, we went to Ferguson, we were having conversations, we were just learning, we were tough, a whole bunch of folks. But then we did this thing, which was like our understanding of how do we visualize solidarity, right? But also banners as not just a banner with a message, but actually a mode of obstruction, of traffic, of capitalism, of all the things. It's a tool. So 11 of these banners, and then the 12th one, when we breathe together, and that's that one of those banners. Those 2 banners are here. If there's something serious, these banners go out. They're not meant to be on the wall, right? They're just framing our conversation for today. And these banners, they just went on, and just on the edge. That's the degree of what we're trying to do here, is just like, we debated a lot about how much Palestine should be present on that banner, and the truth is, it just needed a kufiya on the very edge, and not on both sides. We were coming back from Palestine, and we were part of the Venice Biennale, and then, there was the Israel, pavilion, right? I think it was sovereign, and you have to do the research in this stuff. And the one thing I'll say about Boycott, again, is that it's not against individuals, it's against institutions. It's against state institutional funding. But, boycotts are hard. It's saying no. It's saying no, but it's also saying, again, another yes, a different kind of yes, right? So we were invited in this context as Gulf Labor, but what we did, that was our banner in the Arsenale. That was our banner, and what we did was we kind of did a hamdallah on it, and then we occupied the Israel pavilion, which, by the way, that yellow over there, that you see on the very kind of close right here, they have Gaza, right? So inviting you to make art about killing and oppression isn't what we're talking about. It's not, right? And that's a good way to say no. But when we talk to the curators, it's like, oh, well, this is political art. No. We're not talking about political art. We're talking about struggle. So this is where the name of this space comes from. It's an action. It comes from an action. We're not putting up a show. We're not being here just to kind of like, let's put up an event and a programming. But we're here to learn and unlearn and have the conversation with it when it matters, with the people that it matters. Not because we're not against different opinions. It's we want the right opinions toward the right shared horizon of liberation. And that's the kind of framing that we're bringing to this. And so when we said decolonize this place, the name of the show was This Place. The reason why I said I started with the lineup of the Brooklyn Museum is because Ann Pasternak has gone on, right, to be the head of the Brooklyn Museum. And Laura Rakovitz right now has gone on to be the head of the Queens Museum, right? And recently, Angela Davis was speaking after this action at the Brooklyn Museum, right? And we know this, but this is what our institutions do to us. So we did this, we kind of cracked their tag, This Place, decolonize this place. And it was by the Decolonial Cultural Front. This was a front and back of a brochure, and in the inside, we talked about 2 exhibitions. They had, maybe many of the artists here were in the Agitprop show. It had Martha Rossler, it had many amazing, political artists, Dalit movement, all of these things were covered. And then everything was made miniature, though. It was like these struggles were historic. It's like they've been concluded. It's like we've moved on, let's celebrate something, right? Even the Illuminator, right, had a projection this big. It's insane. So, and then on that 4th floor, on the next side, is a show called This Place. This Place, $6 million of funding. We researched every funding. You need to go to decolonizethisplace.wordpress.com to see the research we've done on each funder. Wow. They're all private. None of them violate BDS, right? Yet they're all somehow Zionist. You don't even know where the money is coming from, right? And that's real. So what was interesting about this thing is like, things are happening in the city. BDS is the beginning of a conversation, but the truth is, how we engage, it's an and. And for us, what was most interesting was connecting displacement in Brooklyn, that the Brooklyn Museum is actually actively participating in, where the board of trustees were developers, where the community had already protested them, where one of the demands was the developer be removed, doing that legwork. And say, you know what? We see you. We see your struggle. And you know what? Have you heard about Palestine? Because there's this show right next to your thing, right, that has a little wall on gentrification, because that was the compromise, right? A little wall on gentrification. And right here, they're actually erasing the Palestinian people indigenous on this land. They've paid Stephen Shore, they've paid Jeff Wall, they paid all these amazing photographers that we study in photography school to go on a tourist trip to Israel, Palestine, that's the only thing they mention, and then come back with tourism shots. So we did direct action. We went in there, we touched their walls, we renamed their stuff, we renamed it back to their indigenous names. We brought these struggles together, and we hurt their brand. And this is the final thing I'll say. We can hurt them, not because we're interested in harm, but because they need to be on our side. We're not going anywhere. The struggles are here. These institutions that represent us and speak in a specific way need to be accountable even for the language that they use to us. And that's what this Decolonize This Place is about.
Awesome. So it's kind of like intimidating to speak after such seasoned people, and I'm here like, I have something to say, so I'm gonna say it. There you go. Actually, in preparation for today, I was reading Robin Kelley and Jasbir Puar, Freedom Dreams and Terrorist Assemblages, as well as Angela Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And because I thought if I was gonna like dress to impress and like sit on this panel with these dope people, that I better know what I was talking about. I felt that I needed to know the who, what, when, where, how, and why of Palestine and the Palestinian struggle. And at that time, I reflected on Angela Davis's interview with Frank Barat in 2014, where she addresses this fabricated assumption that we need to be an expert on an issue in order to stand in solidarity for it. And she actually poses the question of how do we create windows and doors for people who believe in justice to enter and join the Palestinian solidarity movement? So after several hours over the past week of reading these insightful works, I kind of took a step back and asked myself, pretty plain and simple, do I stand with Palestine? With hesitation, hell yes. Period, point blank, in the discussion. And I sit there with my fists in the air, got my swag face on, and I'm ready to free Palestine. Like, I'm ready. I don't need to know much more about it. Like, I'm there. And it's really that simple. Not to say that it isn't important to gain like a deeper understanding of the specific history of the Zionist occupation of Palestine, but it is to say that young Black Americans should never question the bond between oppressed peoples of color worldwide. We don't need validation from anyone. We don't need validation from white people. We don't need it from our families. We don't need it from our schools, our churches. We don't need it from not one person. And so from here, after doing these readings and these reflections, I think about my brother Amin over here, Papa, if you will. And I think, and I ask myself, am I free in my Black body? And the answer is no. And I think, is my brother free in his brown body? And the answer is still no. And I think, are my people displaced by racist imperialism and settler colonialism? Yes. Are my brother's people displaced by imperialism and settler colonialism? Yes. Am I sick and tired of being sick and tired? Yeah, I'd say so. Is he sick? Yeah, we're all sick and tired of being sick and tired. So then I don't need validation from anyone. We're going through the same thing. We experience it together. We talk about it together. There's nothing else that needs to happen. Like, I understand him, he understands me. There's like some solidarity there. There's some mutual understanding. And to refer back to Angela Davis's question, the window by which we as young Black people can enter and join the Palestinian solidarity movement is through this common quest for freedom. The common denominator is struggle, and it doesn't take any sort of special knowledge to know and really believe that. The first step towards bringing down white supremacy is leaving behind its capitalistic racial construction of identity barriers. Not to say that the particulars of our own individual struggles as African Americans, as Latinos, as indigenous peoples, as women, as queers, as the working class aren't important. Nah, not at all. But it is to say that we can't allow geography to get in the way of us seeing the larger picture, or of us realizing that we're all saying fuck you to the same damn people. That is the door we need to walk through as young Black people to join the Palestinian solidarity movement. Now, what happens once you walk through that door is all up to you. As a Black queer woman, I have to figure out what I can do with my talents, my resources, and my voice to take action in solidarity with Palestine. As an artist, I cannot shy away from directly addressing the Palestinian struggle within my work. As an indebted worker in our capitalist-driven society, I cannot fuck with institutions and regimes that financially support Israel's oppressive hand around my Palestinian brothers and sisters' throat. As a human being, I cannot stand idle as people are being violently displaced from their own, yes, I said own, land. It doesn't make sense. So I'll end on this note. We must take action. Palestinians don't need the good intentions and well wishes from the saviors of the West. Fuck that. They need people out there in the streets with them and for them around the world. I've said this to my people here at Decolonize This Place several times, and I'll say it in this instance. Palestinians don't need allies. Black folks don't need allies. Fuck your ally, we need a warrior. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and free Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you for that applause. Fabulous, really powerful and high-octane comments from all the speakers this evening so far. The floor is now open. If you want to ask questions, make short statements, but not long statements. Please respect everyone's patience and time here. I think you'll deal with that side of the room. I'll deal with this side of the room. Okay, I'm going to give the mic to you. If you could just identify yourself and stand up, please.
Hi, my name is Naomi Brussel, and I have been involved with a number of different programs and campaigns in relationship to Palestine liberation. I wanted to respond particularly to what Jasbir was saying about the struggle that happened at the LGBT Center starting in 2011 when they banned us from holding a fundraiser for the U.S. boat to Gaza. What happened was we formed a group called Queers Against Israeli Apartheid in New York City and saying this is a queer group and we should have a right to meet at the center. The center banned us. They were under pressure from Zionists who said they were going to withdraw funds, and the center leadership, so to speak, didn't know what to do with the situation and just kicked us out. We did not stop the campaign. The campaign actually went on for 2 more years. We held meetings in their lobby. We put pressure on various people in the city council, et cetera, including Christine Quinn. Ultimately, 2 years, almost exactly 2 years later, Christine Quinn, who was then, if you remember, running for mayor, and didn't want this little problem of the community center to be, it's her district, it was her district, to be hanging over her during her mayoralty campaign, made an intervention. It was, and we had scheduled Sarah Schulman to speak at the center, and so it was embarrassing for the people in the center to have to ban someone who's quite well known from speaking at the center about Palestine. And so Christine Quinn, in conjunction with the Jewish Council for Community Relations, or the Community Relations Council, made a deal. And she first sent them the agreement to JCRC, and then we were permitted to go back into the center. So we were there for about a year after that, but we did not give up. So, and there was pressure that came from queer groups of color, including the Audre Lorde Project, FEARS, a number of the groups that did put pressure on the leadership, so-called, of the center.
Can I just add that those groups, especially Audre Lorde Project and FEARS, have been fighting with the center forever now about all sorts of issues. So you know, I think a lot of people. So I know that Queers Against Israeli Apartheid kept engaging with the center, but a lot of people just came back to Audre Lorde or Fierce. And certainly Muslim and Arab queers were not interested in, after that horrible town hall, we're not interested in continuing to try to make space for this conversation. And this is the thing about conversation, right? It's an extension of the discourse of normalization. It's as if we haven't been having this conversation over and over and over again for decades, right? So the anti-normalization policy now and the BDS movement is a result of decades and decades of conversation and dialogue. And I think we have to keep remembering and reminding people that we don't have to keep having this conversation because it's been going on for so long.
Andrew, you should take groups of questions.
Yeah, we'll take a couple, maybe 3 questions.
Hey, y'all. My name is Christina. Short and sweet. I appreciated the idea of political art as spectaclism versus political struggle. And that being said, in terms of current movement work and cultural workers and artists who are trying to find different vehicles to educate and empower, how do we move from this, I guess, corporate commercialization, commodification, like all of that, fetishization of struggle? How do we reclaim that in a way that's authentic and moving towards justice, not profit?
Anyone? Well, let's take a couple more questions and just cluster them.
I want to thank all of you for your input and your passion. Yeah, Robin, one thing that I didn't hear you mention it, and I think it may or may not be historical, and I think you're probably a lot more informed about this than me, but you were talking about the chronology of all the various events of 1948. Was there a UN vote on whether Israel would become a state?
Yeah, there was.
And it passed, correct? Okay, but you didn't mention that, did you?
Oh no, I didn't. I did. There's a
Okay.
bunch of stuff.
And then additionally, you mentioned 1967, and more recently that Israel was condemned for possible war crimes against the Palestinian people. So on one hand, you recognized the UN's ability to make a ruling, but the other one, I think you're sort of disagreeing with by not mentioning it. Am I correct or incorrect?
By not mentioning the fact that the UN had based, well, you talking about war crimes? Which one are you talking about?
Well, both. In other words, you mentioned that Israel was accused of war crimes. And,
yeah, I actually never said that.
Oh,
I never said that in my talk. No.
I
mean, but that's
think
true.
you
I mean,
did.
you know, I'll say it now,
Right,
but no.
Right.
But
you did.
I actually never, I never said it. But because, well, you know, I think I understand what you're saying about the UN, but
I thought it would be worthwhile mentioning because that was of chronological importance, wasn't it?
Right. No, of course. And I apologize. Right. I was trying to say in 15 or 17 minutes, just certain highlights.
Right.
So there's a long list of things in the chronology that I didn't include that we could actually talk about.
Right.
But the one thing to keep in mind with the United Nations is that the United Nations in 1948 was not the United Nations in 1975. Right.
Oh, great.
So so the General Assembly versus the Security Council is two different. Whatever General Assembly could pass all kinds of things, but it has no binding power.
Right. Security.
Right. And then the other thing to keep in mind about the United Nations ended up emerging, and this is Du Bois' argument that the United Nations, that the United Nations ought to make colonialism a crime against humanity, and they did not. So that changed the whole nature of the possibilities. But
okay,
anyway, we'll take some others.
Let's take another question.
Oh yeah. Well,
we'll take some others. We'll talk about it.
With lots of views.
Hi, y'all. I'm Hillary. I actually had a question about the UN too, but I guess I have a backup question. For me, I guess almost as I guess I'm also kind of asking for advice. How do we navigate those kind of institutional contradictions of like, you know, artists, and it's also like you gotta eat, but then you don't always know fully what you're supporting, and that information is not always transparent. And I guess that came up with me when y'all were talking about, you know, Angela Davis, and then I thought about, and I hate to like, but like how she endorsed Hillary Clinton, and it made me think about those kind of like how the radical becomes institutionalized and like kind of perpetuates institutions through kind of like this radical rhetoric, even though, so like how do you navigate those kind of contradictions when you're trying to forge real conversation and do like movement work, and then also kind of taking the conversation from like strictly academia like into our communities, because you know we have a lot of talks, and it's kind of like people, like a lot of people kind of like vehemently like agreeing with each other. So it's like, how do we kind of go into our communities and have these conversations and kind of, you know, deal with the contradictions? Yes. Yeah. Oh, thanks.
One more question for the panelists to chew over.
Hey, my name's Quentin. I'm an artist, performer, and a curator around the city. So I guess my question is, like, how often? I remember you mentioned something about like institutions supporting artists. You know, like saying like they support, you know, radical movements, not just academic ones, but also like artist ones. Remember that?
Sure.
Bet. So let's just pretend right now. Okay. So I'm relatively new to this space, like this activism kind of space, and now like I'm working with like an organization that kind of like supports in that kind of way. Like they support artists and like collectively like pushing like, you know what I'm saying, political goals, you know, in activism sense. Like how often do you see that kind of embrace of artists? Because artists really do need support, you know what I'm saying? So like just help me feel optimistic. Like how often do y'all see that kind of stuff?
Your question is also my question. So, but I'll talk about the first question, which is also kind of my question. The idea of like, what do you do when you have to survive as an artist? What do you do when you know that your radical movement work is being reabsorbed by the institution? Or what do you do when rent's due and the only way to make that money is by giving your video to a gallery that's actually gentrifying a neighborhood that you're trying to protect? So like I totally understand that. And currently my answer is I don't know. Because I'm still in school, which is a privilege. And I myself, not being a native New Yorker, I live in Williamsburg, so that's a privilege. That's me gentrifying that area. And so all I know is that I just have to be aware of all of these, right, these privileges. What is my school doing? What is my program doing? What is my institution doing? You know, being in this space, like what is artist space doing? What is common practice? Just really buckling down on all of the specifics, because when all of these answers and specifics are, maybe not answers, but the learning and the unlearning is in your head, then all of your actions will be colored by that, I feel. And I'm still learning, but the idea that like if I had not been in decolonizethisplace, that I couldn't have like met the people to connect Palestine and the movement for Black lives, or connect global wage work and degentrification. But now that I'm aware of it, even though I'm still in the position of a young artist that needs money, I can better navigate the world. Like I can better navigate these like very confusing highways and byways of like white supremacy. So that's me.
Okay, well, I'll just very quickly a couple of things. I wasn't really clear about the United Nations issue. I just want to make it clear that I wasn't advocating the United Nations. I was simply saying that specifically one thing in particular, that was that the Declaration of Human Rights UN was 1948. That was, and I wasn't trying to make a case for or against. We could debate that, but I just want to actually address a couple other things, because these questions are actually all tied together. The corporatization of struggle, what you raised, the contradictions, how do we go into communities and deal with contradictions, navigate the institutional contradictions, how do you avoid being absorbed? And I just want to simply say a couple things that in 20th and 21st century, modern capitalist society, absorption, managed consent, incorporation is way more common than just getting beat down on the head. In other words, we think of like the states engaging in violence against us, but that's true. I don't want to deny that. But the response usually is incorporation, is absorption, and it's not that it's easy work, and that's why the late Stuart Hall had this great line. He talked about hegemony is hard work. The work of hegemony is like this constant. One day, like I told this story at a meeting I was at, one of the convenings in Chicago, and I was saying, what sense does it make to show up at a demonstration with a shirt that says Black Lives Matter made in sweatshops in Guatemala, right? And this is what happens, and it's so easy. It's so easy to sort of not recognize the way absorb. And this is why, the point that you were making about how how much is happening that we can't even see, right? So I think that we have to always recognize that this is a nature struggle. Corporatization is exactly what what hegemony is all about, what counterinsurgency is all about. It's not about jailing us. That's part of it, but a big part's about incorporation. And that, and one thing I want to say about the conversations we have in our communities, my experience over the years and even right now is that some of the most vibrant discussions we have about these contradictions don't take place in academia. They take place in places like the Bog Center in Detroit. They take place here. In fact, you're creating new communities in certain places. They take place at LA Can, downtown Los Angeles, and Skid Row. They take place in South Los Angeles. They take place among people who may not have anything more than a high school degree, but are active. The Los Angeles Black Workers Center in Crenshaw. We have a lot of conversations like that with folks. And so they're creating theory. We think of them as responding or reacting, and like they're but they're creating theory, doing theoretical work of a high level that we're not always in conversation with. And so I think that and creating theory means not to resolve contradictions. People understand better than I do that it's, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Yeah. This constant struggle these contradictions are spaces of richness where you struggle with them to produce a new synthesis, which itself produces new contradictions. They will never go away. And I'm saying, I'm not quoting Mao or anything, but they will never go away. And that's to our benefit.
Can I just add, I think, there's a reason why both Jasbir and Rob and I have some of their readings in my classes, and I think one of them is Discourse on Colonialism, the intro to that, because I think it's really relevant to this conversation. But I just want to address as an artist, they tell us we're not smart enough, but in fact, artists have a lot of power. And I think we're at a time right now where all our labor, the reason we're able to be controlled how many people, 36,000 police officers in New York City controlling how many million, right? It's through self-policing, right? It's through the atomization of us, giving us bullshit jobs. The struggle, the biggest decision I had to make in my life, and this is what we're talking about if you're talking about making art, at least that's what I'm talking about. The choices I had to make coming to this country in an American dream is then realizing it's bullshit. But then taking responsibility for realizing that I'm making money coming from a poor family and having to say, fuck it, right? Because I'm also producing oppression. It's not that I'm Palestinian and then I get a pass, right? It's not that I've been denied back to my homeland last year for making a film as an artist and now I gotta, because that's easy. Then they invite me to talk about it, right? So I say that and then I say, well, what have we been doing? And it's interesting that we're here in artist space, right? So let's think about that. What does that mean? I don't know. This is definitely an institution. So let's say it. Let's talk about it. Let's understand. But it's also not shying away from saying this institution, not all institutions are bad. What are institutions? We're a reflection of them. We consent to them every day. So it's our responsibility to reimagine our institutions. How can we reimagine artist space? Well, it's not as a project, 5 of us coming together and saying, here's what artist space should be. No, it's these new formations, right? It's these new formations around a politics of liberation, right? And that's why these strands matter to us. So then you say, okay, all that is bullshit, it's just talk. We're used to the talk, so then what do? Well, we started with Gulf labor and we took actions against the Guggenheim. And we shut them down multiple times, and we made art in the process. You can say that's art, and you can say that's activism, and you'd be like, that's political art, and that's discourse. No, we shut shit down. And it looked beautiful, and we felt good. Right? And then we say, but now that can easily be commodified. That's over there, what about over here? Right? And that's Orientalist, right? Because everyone loves, sticking up for workers, brown workers away. So what about over here? And then the question is like, look at the Brooklyn Museum. Why? Why can they go around displacing people, putting up political art, hiring us to do certain things? And you're just like, now you can say, I gotta eat. But honestly, then we gotta read A Dry White Season by Andre Brink. We gotta understand what struggle is, that it doesn't begin and end with our life. Right? That neoliberalism does all sorts of bullshit to us. That Robin was talking earlier about self-care and how that's bullshit. So let's talk about that. I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I am, but I don't mean to, so I misspoke. But what I'm trying to say is like, one way to think about self-care, and I just learned this from Robin, and I think people should ask him about it because it's an interesting idea. It's just like, self-care is a neoliberal thing. What about revolution and then collective care? Right? And I'm quoting Robin.
I wanted to add, we've kind of gone over some of the basics of incorporative complicity and control societies, right? Like this is a kind of mapping around discipline and control and what it means to have the prison extended into everyday forms of surveillance, that kind of thing. So these are the forms of incorporation that mean that there are no political spaces of purity. It's impossible, right? So the contradictions are really important. There are places that we learn, there are places that we connect up with other people, and there are places where we are forced to make decisions and to stand by them. And the thing that's also really interesting to me, and this is what I learned the first time I went to the West Bank, is that the boycott itself and the occupation itself is full of contradictions. The Palestinians live intensely contradictory lives every day. And these methods of incorporation are massive and subtle, so that there are 100 different Palestinian ID cards, and every status is slightly different from the status of the person next to you. And these are ways of segregating out people, but also saying, hey, you're included, so what else do you want, So it's not who's included and who's not, but how are people being included? And what are the costs of those inclusions, and what are the contradictions in those of those inclusions? So to say to yourself, you will never avoid the contradictions. They will be part of the ongoing formation of solidarity, connections and struggles, and your own growth as a person in solidarity with these other people.
Okay, more questions?
Thank you all, and thanks to everyone for packing this room tonight. I'm really inspired that we talked about BDS being the floor, not the ceiling, because it still shows that BDS is crucial, that it's really solid ground on which we're standing. And I wanted to dig in on that a little bit. When people are talking about BDS globally, that's one thing that's crucial in talking about very concrete forms of solidarity. BDS here in the United States is something entirely more powerful, though, when you have several $billions a year that the United States funds to maintain Israeli apartheid. So when we're talking about solidarity and decolonization not being a metaphor, but a very tangible practice, that means that what we do in this country has a dramatic effect in Israeli apartheid and Israeli occupation being maintained. So I want to dig in a little bit more. In talking about in universities, in addition to cutting ties with Israeli universities, and again, focusing on institutions and not individuals, that also means welcoming collaborations with Palestinian institutions. Rabab Abdulhadi and the San Francisco State University making a partnership with An-Najah University, right? Or supporting the Right to Education tour that Palestinian students make every year. In neighborhood work, that also means not just limiting the BDS struggle to the campus, right? But also trying to figure out in your union, is there a way that you can specifically blockade Israeli goods, as our comrades on the West Coast and the longshore workers have shown, right? Is there a specific way that you can go out into communities like in Queens, like in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and connect with Arab and Muslim brothers and sisters and everyone on the gender spectrum to connect with them and ask, what are your concerns? How can we be supportive with each other? And I guess the very last thing to say is when trying to figure out what we're doing here, this space will be in existence until December 17th. But we need to figure out how to stay connected and to be able to amplify the work that we're doing when there are these different moments of possibility. And I'll give two examples. One example is that we had someone who was an architect of the broken windows policy who just recently announced his resignation, right? And he stepped down. That doesn't mean the NYPD is going to end with Bill Bratton leaving, but that does mean that it's a possibility to push them and to push broken windows policies that happen all around the world, including in Palestine. The second thing is, 2017 is going to be the 70th year anniversary of the Nakba, the catastrophe, right? So what we can be trying to do is connecting here and in all the neighborhoods where we're organizing to try and figure out 2017, making it lit as fuck in talking about the Nakba, right? And in how we're trying to build a response to that and escalating to end Israeli apartheid through our strategic place here. So thank you again, everyone, and let's power up.
Hi, my name is Jasbir K. I'm a community organizer in Jackson Heights. I work with a lot of immigrants and people who are just very new to this country, specifically from Muslim-majority countries. Sorry, there's a lot of people trying to pass me right now. So one thing I realize is working with these groups of people is that there isn't a lot of time in their lives to come out and support these type of actions, to come out and support anything that is maybe a little to the left or maybe a little too radical because they're new to this country. There's a lot of people who are afraid. So how are we working not only for the artists who are obviously also need to survive and need to eat, but these immigrant families who are supporting families here, who are supporting families back home, to include them into these movements and make sure that they're part of this too?
Any others? Just want to remind people who are leaving that if you want to get involved in organizing around this issue, we're convening a meeting tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock here in this space. All comers are welcome to share information about organizing around BDS in their sector.
And use the hashtag.
Yeah, use that hashtag up there. a question back there.
Thank you so much for all of your amazing presentations. They're very thought-provoking. This is just a really quick abstract question. I was just wondering if there has been an instance ever in the work that you've done where you've seen the kind of dangers of metaphor occasionally, where Palestine becomes co-opted and applied in various ways that are not actually, in fact, applicable and in danger of creating a kind of internal hegemony, a seamless space that then knocks out a lot of the productive tensions that can come from exploring, historical specificity of these different struggles. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know if I can try to approach all those questions. On this question of the vulnerability of immigrant working class populations, I think it's a really great question. I can never, I never make like prescriptions, but I can describe things that happen. So at Los Angeles, where I live, one of the most vibrant organizations there is the Bus Riders Union. They were formed by the LA Community Strategy Center, and it's an organization that has a very large immigrant working class population. And it's not that they didn't come just immediately. Some of them came through organizations like Kiwa, the Korean workers organization. And then some of them, a lot of both Central American and other Latino immigrants who are working class vulnerable come out of movements themselves. Now the thing is, they don't always come out for events, but the Bus Riders Union was one of these things where much of the organizing took place on the bus, so they're already there. And much of what they were doing was dealing with transit fares, and then that became, moving toward the environmental destruction of both the trains and the diesel fuel replacement with clean energy. Basically working around these kinds of issues. And that's one thing. And the other thing, which one of my favorite organizations here in New York was Sister to Sister, which is based in Brooklyn. And, they're an amazing organization. We had fundraisers for them when I lived in New York. And one of the things that they were always doing is organizing around what was specific to their community. That was questions of domestic violence in their neighborhood. So no one was actually going anywhere. And it wasn't like mass actions. It was just simply, how do we get delegations of people to try to reduce domestic violence? Because when we call the police end up deporting people who are important for the maintenance of the family. How do we come up with other ways to resolve that? And I'm not saying like this is what people should do. I'm just saying these are examples where sometimes just writing people's homes or just getting together just as community to be able to have conversations about like life here, life someplace else. It's amazing what just a conversation with some food does. Not as an action, but just being in your house. It's just a beautiful thing. I can't speak to the metaphor question. Jasbir will talk about that and everyone else. But I do want to say something about self-care, just to make sure that it's clear. Because it's true. I think of it as a neoliberal model, and this is what I meant by that. Was that the thing that we need to do, which we call self-care, is collective care. In other words, what we do is caring for ourselves as a community. Because no one who really is who's political in this sense does self-care as an individual act. It's about caring for each other. But once we call it self-care, what we do is we relinquish the commons, we relinquish the state, we relinquish any kinds of institutions that we're calling for that should provide for us. So the next step to self-care is like, you know what? You don't need doctors or hospitals. You just like, heal yourself, brother, sister, just, basically do surgery. We don't have to, So it becomes this sort of thing where we think of self-care, because self-care initially was tied to the self-help movement and to, inspirational speakers who were basically saying, you know what, you could do this yourself. And that was my concern about the way it's being used. And it's not the way it's being practiced, but we have to rename it so that we actually continue to think of building the commons as opposed to becoming atomized individuals. And that's what I was trying to get at, So.
Just to add to that, it is amazing how many having to work diligently in classrooms to wrench the narrative of self-care out of students' heads and make them understand. The narrative usually goes, if I take care of myself, then I can help my community, right? Instead of the other way around, or even instead of what we would think of as like a social model addressing disability, which is really about the social conditions being either enabling or debilitating. And the Black Panthers had a model for this, and the Young Lords had a model for this, for community care. And these are the kinds of models and histories that now have been absorbed in the self-help industry, basically, right? So this is an issue. The metaphor question is interesting to me. For a while, but I think that metaphors also circulate. So for a while, the big kind of metaphoric comparison was with South African apartheid, right? And that had a lot of traction for a while, until I think about 3 or 4 years ago, and it was both a way of stenciling, a kind of immediately stenciling the stakes of what was happening by saying, look, this was South African apartheid, and now we have to look at Israeli apartheid, or look at Israel as an apartheid state. But it was also a way of assuming that people actually cared about South African apartheid at that time, which is quite an assumption to make. And then, and that people knew what South African apartheid was, which was another huge assumption to make. So but at the same time, it was politically expedient. It actually drew a lot of people into a certain kind of conversation. So I have understood these various frameworks, the Jim Crow framework, the South African apartheid framework, the pinkwashing and anti-pinkwashing framework, now Black Lives Matters, and that kind of connectivity, these forms of connectivity to do certain kinds of political work at certain moments, and they become entryways, and then may or may not change into other things, but that they help us move things in a certain comparative way, sometimes in terms of a necessary imaginary that help people click into. And again, it's in a kind of an immediate stencil, like what are the stakes here? Even though South African apartheid and Israeli apartheid are completely different systems and have completely different geographies. But it took a while before we could just show the maps of Israel and say, you know what, we don't have to compare this to South African apartheid. We just look at what's happening here with the land. So I think we can say, like, there are kind of strategic essentialisms, to borrow from Gayatri Spivak. There are kinds of strategic essentialisms that we mobilize at certain moments, that have force at certain moments.
I can just add a few words to the idea of metaphor by saying, on the poster, we say decolonization is not a metaphor. And I think that's what we mean about this practice that we're doing here. It's a heavy, heavy work, and it's a history, and it's a practice, and it's a process, and we don't know exactly what it means, but we're engaged in it, and we're taking it on. And I think each one of us must do that. In the context of, quoting Mahmoud Darwish in Palestine as a metaphor from poetry, I think that's important in that context, because as a Palestinian engaged in the struggle for Palestine, I'm really engaged for freedom and what that means, right? And if I'm engaged for freedom and what that means, then it doesn't look like a border with a geography and an oppressive government that then looks like any other government, which is what all the Arab uprisings has given the Arab folks who rose up, right? But also the fact that, democracy and freedom are a practice as well, and a responsibility. So those are kind of, I don't have a theory behind metaphor, I'm just very cognizant of it. And I feel like one thing I'll say as an organizer, as a person who's engaged in struggle, specificities of the struggle matter and who leads them, right? Metaphors aside, like that's a must.
I think a lot of what we're talking about has to do with trust. The idea that different people from different struggles can trust other people and other struggles. How does that trust get built? It's really a case-by-case specific thing. Within Decolonize This Place, I think, at least in my experience, it's easy to trust because the politics and the community agreements and everything's pretty spelled out. So you come into the space kind of already knowing that, kind of already agreeing with that, knowing that people are gonna take time to listen to you and your struggles and your personal story, and with the expectation that you will also listen to and hear them out. But in terms of outside of safe spaces such as these, I think that trust is just something we have to work on, trusting that we know what we're talking about, trusting that we do have a common enemy or a common struggle, and trusting that that struggle is gonna be the thing that gets us to overcome. So I think that it's really difficult because you don't want your one cause to get absorbed by another, but at the same time, you need other causes in order for your one cause to be heard. And it just goes back to trust.
So, in the spirit of community care, we do try and respect people's time and patience, as I said earlier on, and we've sort of gone a little bit beyond the time we set for ourselves. I wanted, just in finishing, we want to draw your attention to a draft of a pledge to resist the art washing of occupation. It's a living document. It was drafted fairly quickly in anticipation and preparation of for this event, and it's in the pamphlet, right? Yeah. It's in the pamphlet, so you can read it there. Take it away, circulate it. There will be follow-up. This is just an initial. This is the gateway drug, as Jasbir memorably put it. Again, tomorrow evening, if you want to come back here, we'll be comparing, sharing strategies for organizing and how to move forward. And please mingle. Part of community formation is the conversations we have after events like this. It's very important. But before you do that, a big round of applause again for our panelists.